taking photographs, so this is going to be recorded. We're not doing audience reactions though, it's just going to be the speaker. So there won't be any audience shots of you laughing or crying or anything.
Whenever I make a joke, they all go, ah.
Okay, make it clear when you've made a joke. So is the camera, are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, okay. So I'll let Regina introduce, or shall I introduce yourself?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Regina Surber. I work for the ICT for Peace Foundation. And for the last 2.5–3 years, we have been working on a project on approaches in the scientific area of artificial intelligence and autonomous technology, especially autonomous weapon systems. And I know Toby from university, and so that's the reason why I'm here. We're going to give you an introduction in the topic of autonomous weapon systems and the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts process that you will, as far as I know, be modeling tomorrow. And so yeah, I think I'm going to speak for the next 30–45 minutes, and depending on what kind of framework you, Jack and Toby, had in mind, maybe I'd say if you have questions, please ask them, not only at the end. You can interrupt me. So like this, we have a dialogue. There's, in my opinion, already enough monologues in the world, about the world, so just in case something is unclear, please ask. Okay, so let's see if this works. Fantastic. So I'm just going to give you a short overview of the red thread that I'm going to follow during the next little bit less than an hour. So first, I'd like to give you some preliminary answers to the question of what lethal autonomous weapon systems are, and why they're unique, and why they're worthy of a United Nations Group of Governmental Experts discussion, and also why they're worthy of a parallel discussion that you're going to have here tomorrow. I'm also going to say some words about the attribute autonomous, which is very often a little bit misunderstood, and which is a vague term as well. And I'm going to give you some examples of weapon systems that exist today and that could actually fall maybe into the category called autonomous weapon systems or lethal autonomous weapon systems. And then I would like to explain to you the military interests behind developing and using autonomous weapon systems. So the question, why are they developed? Because without a military interest, they would not be developed, and we wouldn't have had the discussion about them, not the real one, not the parallel one. And then I'd like to come back to the weapon systems themselves. I'd like to explain to you why they are particularly uniquely problematic compared to other weapons. I'll speak about a technological problem, a legal problem, which is the main reason why those weapons have been taken up by the United Nations, because the special framework of disarmament and arms control, where those weapon systems are discussed, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, is a framework that looks at weapons from a legal perspective. So the legal problem is one of the reasons why we are discussing those weapons. And then I will say something from a more philosophical perspective or from an ethical perspective. So I'll speak about considerations of some moral principles that it is said that we as humans or as an international community uphold, and in what way autonomous weapon systems could go against certain principles. And then I will speak about the Group of Governmental Experts process, about which I don't know, I think you know already quite something because of your preparations for your country positions. And lastly, I'd like to speak about in what way this process, this debate is limited for the effective dealing with autonomous weapon systems. And in point number 5, I'm also going to speak about future warfare, which not only contains autonomous weapon systems, but is also dependent on other emerging technologies. Okay, good. So any questions until now? Okay, let's start. So what are lethal autonomous weapon systems? Lethal autonomous weapon systems are, we can say, a paradigmatic case of the dual-use aspect of technology. So what is the dual-use aspect of technology? Dual-use aspect of technology basically means that any technology, being an artifact or an instrument designed or developed to be used can be used for good, in simple words, and for bad. And it depends on intention, on human intention or on state intention, how technology is used. How, in the case of autonomous weapon systems, so-called autonomous softwares are used. And the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts is a place where different intentions do clash. And it is a place where this international framework of the United Nations tries to guide those intentions and limit some of those intentions. So I believe it's just important for you to have this in mind. And then autonomous weapon systems, they are a result of an immense technological evolution, I'd say evolution, not development, that's currently underway. The core of autonomous weapon systems, I believe as many of you know, is a software that was developed because of recent developments in different scientific fields, for example, machine learning. I think I put it in the general input that I wrote for you. It's a particular approach in the scientific field of artificial intelligence, but it also depends on biology, psychology, computer vision, and robotics, of course. And then, it is not yet generally defined what an autonomous weapon system really is. So definitions on the one hand side, they are very important, because if we want to regulate something, maybe criminalize something or ban something, then of course it's important that we understand what we mean when we talk about this something. However, definitions are also always limitations, because definitions are a snapshot of a general understanding at a certain point in time. And with regards to autonomous weapon systems, general understanding, as you might know, of states is not uniform. States do not even agree whether something like autonomous weapon systems already exist or not, so it's not really agreed upon whether they are only an idea or whether they are reality. And another point with regards to autonomous weapon systems, the technology that drives the development of autonomous weapon systems is evolving so fast that future more or even higher or more highly autonomous weapon systems are going to be developed for sure. And if we have a preliminary or a real definition set today, maybe this definition will not capture more sophisticated weapons of the future. And if this definition is tied to legal consequences, then those legal consequences might also not reach future weapons systems. So I just want you to keep this in mind, because one of the tasks of the group of governmental experts is to decide whether or not to define them and how to define them. Okay, good. So, besides those critical remarks, I would like to give you some anchoring characteristics that help you to understand what they could be. So first, it sounds very simple. What does lethal mean? Lethal means deadly. However, it's important to understand that autonomous weapon systems or lethal autonomous weapon systems cannot and are not only used during war, but can, and in some places of the world, I'll show you some examples, are also used during peacetime, during law enforcement operations, for example, during crowd control or in hostage situations. So now, during war, soldiers that are entitled to use weapons are entitled to use weapons in order to potentially kill an adversary. However, a police officer that uses a weapon is per se under a duty to use the least harmful means possible. So when we speak about autonomous weapon systems outside of war, many people argue that we should not call those weapon systems lethal autonomous weapon systems. So just for you to understand, I introduced this now, I'm going to talk about those different areas later. Terminology is something very, very important when we talk about those issues. So, and then why do we say weapon systems and not just weapon? So a weapon system, is basically a platform, a plane or a tank or a ship equipped with a weapon. Very simple. An autonomous weapon system is a weapon system that is equipped with a software that allows the whole complex, so the platform, the weapon, and the software integrated into it, to identify, to track, to search, and to attack a target, more military targets or military infrastructure or soldiers, for example, without human control, without a human operator. So, for example, there is no pilot or no one that has to pull the trigger in their books. The weapon system with the software does it by itself. And this is possible because the software integrated into the weapon system is capable of continuously gathering information from its environment, to analyze this information, and to calculate outputs or create decisions, actions, or reactions by itself based on the information that it analyzes. And the software is capable of modifying its behavior if the environment changes, because it continuously takes in information. Yes?
This is a generally accepted definition of autonomous weapon systems, that there is no human whatsoever in the loop.
No, this is not a generally accepted definition. There is two different versions discussed. There is the idea of having a human on the loop, so a human that can still veto a decision or an output by an autonomous weapon system. And then there are certain voices that say, okay, a real autonomous weapon system is a weapon system where the human actually is out of the loop, so no human can stop in case a weapon system has taken a certain course of action. Okay. Any other questions? So an autonomous weapon system, in simple words, is to some degree capable of adjusting its behavior to changing situations by itself without human input. So it can act in unforeseeable situations, in situations of uncertainty. This is the reason why the term autonomous is used for those purposes. Okay. So now I'd like to give you just some examples of weapon systems that could be termed autonomous or highly autonomous. This is the Dassault Neuron. It is an unmanned combat airplane. It is one of the weapon systems with, let's say, the highest level of autonomy, if we use those terms that currently exists. The flight control and the combat management function without human input, so there's no pilot there. And it is relatively small, so the wingspan is 12 meters. Usually a plane is, we regard planes a little bit bigger, and I will get back to this very point because it's important for something else that I'm going to talk about. This is the Samsung Tekui. It is a sentry gun. It basically takes on the full role of a soldier. It can identify a danger, it can calculate countermeasures and execute countermeasures. So that means in case someone's approaching that shouldn't approach, worst case scenario, this robot can analyze that this person is maybe a danger and it can shoot at this person. It was used in a demilitarized zone between North and South Korea for a couple of years, and now apparently not anymore. It's one of the most militarized zones on the planet, so just think carefully when you use terms. It's sometimes a little bit confusing. So here you see the Boeing X-37B. It is the United States' first reusable space plane. It's not officially a weapon system. It's not sure if it's a weapon system. But as what makes an autonomous weapon system autonomous is the software integrated into the platform. We can, of course, imagine that at some point in the future, if intentions are there, this software is integrated in a reusable spacecraft as well. So it's 9 meters high, so it's actually relatively small as well. It was an independent photographer who took a photo 10 days ago and it was in orbit and no one really knows what it's doing up there. It is capable of carrying a payload that it can release into the atmosphere, so it has some militarily interesting features already. And now I'd just like to show you two weapons systems with autonomous features used outside of war scenarios. here you see the Israeli Dogo. It's a very, very small tank. It's 30 centimeters small, and it's equipped with a 9mm pistol. It can enter houses silently, and it can climb stairs. And this allows police officers not to risk their lives because they can send in this small little tank before they enter a dangerous situation. And here, this is a drawing. This is a so-called skunk drone. It's a drone equipped with pepper spray. It was purchased by North Indian State in 2014. And it is built to shower crowds with pepper spray. For example, in case authorities are not able to handle or to keep crowds in certain borders, in case of demonstrations or some other situations. Okay. So maybe some of you, I hope at least, have now a big question mark in your head, like why do we develop those things? So what are the military interests behind those weapons? Yeah.
The last two systems you introduced, those are both remote controlled though, right?
Excuse me?
The last two systems you mentioned?
Yeah.
But those are both remote controlled, right?
They can be remote controlled, but they also can take on tasks by themselves.
Okay.
Yes.
At the current stage they're at, they can already take on tasks by themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe one question. You started with the picture of the drone. Isn't that the old debate whether or not the platform is the problem or the weapon that you put on it? I mean,
With the Dassault Neuro, this one?
yeah. On the Samsung robot, it's pretty clear. It's stationary. It's a like functional weapon system. For the drone, could be used for whatever reasons.
Yes.
So the regulation might be directed at something else.
So you mean that, especially when we speak about a drone or an unmanned plane, it's evident that the software is the problem.
Yes, you have the Mantis system on ships or on everything else that protect the troops for incoming dangers or something else. And this is something that you could put on a drone, on a tank, on a house, on whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so isn't that more the problem than the actual platform that moves it?
Exactly. The difference between a currently existing remotely controlled drone and a highly autonomous drone doesn't lie in the casing, but it lies in the software. And I'll come back to that. So this is just to show you what's existing nowadays, but we will talk about, let's say, more ethereal systems or the real software problem a little bit later. Thank you very much for bringing this up. Are there any other questions? Okay. So why do we or should we develop autonomous weapon systems? What are the military interests behind autonomous weapon systems? So if we, I think many of us know that, but sometimes it needs to be said, if we lift all the security, political, and diplomatic curtains, military interests are very often just economic interests. And there is a tremendous economic interest in autonomous weapon systems because, as I've said before, an autonomous or lethal autonomous weapon system is capable of identifying a target, tracking a target, attacking a target without a human controller, without a human operator. This means that there need not be any safeguard for a human being, for a pilot, or for a driver, or for a human soldier on the weapons platform anymore. And this is what classically made weapons platform heavier and bigger and more expensive. So autonomous weapon systems can be much smaller, much lighter, and much cheaper because there is no human being on the platform anymore. And then another reason why it can be of military interest to develop and use autonomous weapon systems is that compared to non-autonomous machines, autonomous weapon systems can continue their task also when, for example, a communication link breaks down between the commander and, classically, on non-autonomous weapon systems, the human operator. Because an autonomous weapon system, as I said in the beginning, can act to a certain degree by itself. This is often summed up under the term operational necessity. And then it's also often said that they are useful because they can take on the dull, the dangerous, and the dirty work that classically soldiers have to do. And this saves a lot of human lives of soldiers on the side of the conflict party that can deploy autonomous weapon systems. So there is a scaling down of human casualties because you do not have to send in human beings anymore. And then there is a last argument of some people that claim that autonomous weapon systems could maybe comply better with international humanitarian law, IHL, the legal rules that count in case there is a war. That those are the legal rules that soldiers have to comply with. And the argument goes as follows: as autonomous weapon systems are machines, they are not distracted by human emotions such as fear or the desire for revenge, which can blur a little bit our capacity to comply with legal rules. So this is a very unique selling argument, especially for apologists of international law. However, it is discussed, and it's very unstable, I'd say, because it is not at all clear that a software is capable to understand the way human beings understand, let alone understand legal rules. Okay, so why are autonomous weapon systems so problematic? So, as I've said at the beginning, an autonomous weapon system is capable to gather information and learn what's going on in its environment. And certain approaches to machine or software learning are so complex that the human being is not capable to understand why a software has behaved in the way that it has. So it is very, very often impossible to locate the technological trigger process in the software that has created the output of a software, of an autonomous software. And therefore, the problem is also there in autonomous weapon systems. So this means that autonomous weapon systems are not only unpredictable when we look into the future because they can act and react in situations of uncertainty by themselves, but they're also very often unexplainable when we look back, because we cannot with certainty say why they created the output that they have created. This is often referred to as the black box problem of highly complex learning software. And this entails a very big legal problem, because when an autonomous weapon system, let's say, makes a mistake, we cannot understand why. Because we cannot understand what little process in this highly tightly coupled process of an autonomous software has triggered the mistake. And if we cannot understand why there is a mistake, or why the weapon system has made a mistake, for example, why it has killed a person that it shouldn't kill, we cannot decide who is responsible. Is it the military commander? Is it the software designer or the engineer, or is it the scientist that has created the mathematical basis to create the software in the first place? We don't know because of this technological problem. And autonomous technology is used in situations where when it creates a mistake, humans are put severely at risk. Think about war, or think about maybe also autonomously driving cars. So this is a great legal problem, because if we cannot say who is responsible, we cannot decide who is legally liable or accountable in case someone is hurt. And this problem of legal accountability or human responsibility is the core of the legal problem that has been taken up by the group of governmental experts process. Yes, you were first.
Are you talking about individual responsibility or state responsibility? Because if a state uses a system, a soldier, something, he or she is responsible in any case. It might be different to who's liable then for.
Yes, those are different questions of two different legal realms.
Yeah.
And then, so state responsibility would be with regards to international humanitarian law, which is a question that is also still discussed, as you will know, in what way states have to comply to principles or actually to legal duties or legal obligations. But then on the other hand side, maybe there is someone else also responsible in the development process or in the targeting process. Those are questions that have to be decided, because it is not at all agreed upon that only a state is responsible in case something goes wrong.
This is then for liability questions of individual
Yes,
criminal
individual
intent or
human
something.
complaint.
All right, thank you.
But those questions are not answered yet.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, and you had a question as well?
That was very similar
Uh-huh.
to my.
Okay, so, anyway, good. Okay. Any other question? Yeah?
Sorry. So, get all the concept of machine learning, and with respect to the machine learning, there could be a possibility that the accountability ends at the point where the machine self-learned it, and then it took that measure or step that led to the killing of the human.
Then
So-
the accountability, you'd say, would lie actually at the machine.
Like basically, then it makes it legally, it's questionable on the legal aspect. Then who would to rest the responsibility with?
Exactly, this is the problem. So this is what's discussed. It is discussed, there is a general understanding in from the state representatives, the group of governmental experts, that human responsibility cannot be, or legal accountability cannot be transferred to a machine. This is the reason why, and I'll say some words about that after, this concept of meaningful human control that I'm sure you've crossed is very important, because there are some arguments that really say, since this is not possible to hold a machine accountable for certain actions, there must be a human somewhere, either already in the development process of an autonomous weapon system, or somewhere in the targeting process, in those steps of identifying, searching, and attacking and tracking a target, that in case something goes wrong can be made responsible. Because how to transfer legal accountability to a machine? Those are questions that are discussed, that are intuitively, let's say, answered in the negative, and this is the reason why human control is an element that is argued for very prominently.
Maybe there's something I'm missing, but what's the issue with just having the owner of the machine be responsible? Just the person who bought it and decided to place it at that specific location. Why do they not have full accountability?
So in case of war, then it would be the commander or the military official that's representing the state. And so the state would be the owner of the weapon. And in war, it's the legal framework of international humanitarian law that is the main reference point. And international humanitarian law is a legal system that is based on individual human responsibility. So this is something that wouldn't really go well with international humanitarian law. And I believe the states are just in general unwilling to take on this responsibility, but this is a question that could be discussed as well. This is the answer that I can give to you at the moment. It's maybe not 100% satisfying.
I was also thinking in terms of, let's say, like outside of the private property, someone decides to put turrets of sorts, and then in that case, it would be very clear that, let's say, the bank itself would be responsible if the turret kills somebody.
Yeah. In outside of war scenarios, questions of legal liability are, it makes intuitively sense. I'm not an expert on private law. This is still discussed, but that seems per se like a valuable option to go. But it is not with autonomous weapon systems that are still to be defined. Those are still open questions, and those are important. Any other questions? So let's say this question of human responsibility and legal accountability is, we can say, somehow a distillation of broader philosophical concerns. So what is actually happening is that we are outsourcing, or we are at risk to outsource control and responsibility for one of the most destructive and dangerous human capacities, namely to kill another human being, to software or to machines. And thereby we somehow seem to limit the space for human responsibility in the world. And this seems to go a little bit or greatly against a conception of an autonomous and sovereign individual human being that is responsible for its own actions. And it also goes a little bit or greatly against the idea of a society that is based on in sovereign and autonomous individual beings of that sort. So this is sometimes an argument on a, let's say, higher level of abstraction that is named in this discussion. And then I'd just like to name one particular security challenge of autonomous weapon systems. As we have talked about, autonomous weapon systems, since they can perform actions in situations of uncertainty without human input, they can, in theory, become very, very small. Not only 12 meters or 9 meters, but in theory, they could become very, very small, maybe the size of a fly. And in theory, we can imagine that very few people can launch an unlimited number of very small autonomous weapon systems. And this makes autonomous weapon systems a potentially scalable weapon of mass destruction. So, like a nuclear bomb is a weapon of mass destruction. And I'll explain to you why. So we can imagine that 2 or 3 million small autonomous weapon systems can be carried in a cargo aircraft or in a container truck, but operated only by 2 or 3 people instead of 2 or 3 million. And they would be cheap, they would be effective, they would be able to eliminate people even inside buildings. And once major powers initiate mass production, they would be accessible on the international arms market. And they would have one very important advantage to a nuclear bomb or a classical weapon of mass destruction. So with a nuclear bomb, there is a cataclysmic threshold. There is a moment, an either-or moment. Either one uses the bomb and there is massive destruction, or no one uses the bomb and there is no destruction and we're fine. And we have not crossed this threshold since 1945, often by sheer luck. And with swarms or groups of autonomous weapon systems, of small autonomous weapon systems, there is no such threshold, because one could deploy 100, then 1,000, in theory 10,000, 100,000, and so on, and attacks could escalate smoothly. So the technology for those ideas exists, and there are initiatives in the US and in the UK, and maybe in some other countries as well. And we know the human, we are very curious and very bored, and we very often try out whatever we can. So this is something to keep in mind, which is a characteristic unique to this new technology. Okay, good. Any question? Yeah?
When you start to build some weapons like that, there must also in the same moment are groups that build the anti-weapon to that, because humans are not stupid. So they think, okay, that is the fear that somebody will build a swarm. So I will build a net to protect myself, my country. So what is the specific problem when you think about the situation in that way, that it's just involvement and the people will
It's just
build,
what?
it's just evolution of the weapon.
Yeah.
It's just evolution of how you start, how you fight. You can let the problem solve itself with the anti-weapon maybe, or what's the real fear what you have to have with this weapon, because people can always do it.
Yeah, and for sure, I think you have a point with anti-weapon. I would still say that the problem is there on many levels. For sure, on a level that it is developed, and that in case an anti-weapon is not developed that can tackle this very algorithm, still people can be put at risk. And then I would still say it's still problematic if it is possible to develop those things, because if it's possible to develop those things, it is possible for our minds to think that those things are allowed to be developed, which I believe is the most problematic feature of this whole new dangerous or potentially dangerous developments. And then what's also problematic is that also if an anti-weapon is developed, or if the software is created that can hack what software is included in particular autonomous weapon systems or small autonomous weapon systems, as softwares evolve very quickly, I assume we have a beta version very soon, and then you would have a way of pro and con. So I believe that there is no final answer or no final, in case you have a storm and there's just the anti-weapon, I don't believe that this can solve any kind of warring behavior or intention to use or create those kind of things. You were first, I believe, no?
What I also think is dangerous about this is that if we develop such software that is capable of like full loop of an attack, is that software will be leaked at some point. Because
Yes.
software can be copied quite easily. Like if we develop a platform, we cannot just copy it over and run away with it. But software we can. We can copy for free. So it will be leaked at some point. That's not a question of will it happen or will it not happen. It will happen. The question is only when. As soon as we develop such software.
Yes.
And then we'll get into hands, for example, also like will be used for terrorist attacks. Like drones are cheap, and I don't need a military grade drone to try an attack. So the question is like, do we then run around with anti-weapons all on our body, or how do we go about this?
Yeah, I mean, you touch a very important point. It's that this whole emerging technology community is characterized with big openness. So a lot of knowledge is accessible by many, many people that have access to a computer or that have access to internet, and it's often either for free or very, very cheap. So this is often called the democratization of technological knowledge in this field. So what is developed here is to a big part not developed as software, not as the weapon itself, often not developed behind closed military research centers, but those technologies are developed in the civil sector. So for not necessarily to be used in weapons. So this is the reason why it is more accessible. Yes.
I would even argue that even if this software was developed in close military settings, it would most likely leak at some point. As like if we develop an aircraft, I can probably leak the plans for this aircraft, which is already bad. But somebody who wants to like use it in an attack still has to find engineers that can build this thing for him, and like spend a lot of money to do so. So we are talking about the state level attacker.
Exactly.
But here, like if the software is leaked, it can be used by me and you, even without much further technological knowledge.
That's true. It depends on our intentions and where we want to guide our money to. Then certain ideas can become reality, and what you just named is one of those. And those are all things that we have to keep in mind. And you also have a question.
I'm not sure yet how it stands today and with how this technology has progressed, but do you know if these weapon systems do have the capability to sort of differentiate proportionality? Because if we're talking about warfare and international humanitarian law, one of the first things that come up is how much is acceptable.
Collateral damage, you mean civilians, this kind of proportionality?
Yeah, combatants, like on both sides, like if you attack
No, rather it.
You mean distinction?
Yeah.
Okay, You ask if it is, if it's clear that a weapon system is able to distinguish a soldier from a civilian, for example.
That could also be a question, but also because I know in international humanitarian law, one of the principles is the principle of like proportionality,
Yes.
where they should know how much they can defend themselves and attack back, and how much is too much.
In a certain attack.
Yeah, in a certain
Yes.
attack, in specific warfare situations. So I'm wondering if these systems already have this ability. Are you aware if they do?
No,
or
they don't. They don't.
that would probably
This
be
is,
a question.
this is at least general agreement. I'm not part of the close military research, but this is general told, but anytime technicians or technologists come and speak at those conferences, that they basically say that this is impossible, or still impossible. And there are a lot of questions related to this, especially with regards to understanding. It's not clear, it's not 100% clear how the human brain works. So if we model the human brain, we don't know what it means to understand. So maybe what we model is not understanding. So, and when we require that someone understands a legal rule, and we're not 100% sure that what we're modeling is something that can understand, then the question about understanding legal rules and complying with legal rules is still big non-answer.
Yes. I've got a question relating to something you mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation. You said that the terminology lethal was contingent as laws can also be used in law enforcement, so nationally. As far as I've understood it, these systems are being developed or research is being conducted in order to have like state-to-state interaction and not to use them to enforce law nationally. So are there actually plans of using them, for instance, for police work?
Yeah, those two examples that I've shown you before, I can go back. There's more. This one here. This is used in Israel during law enforcement operations, and this one's used in India. I can give you some other examples or write down some arms development companies that particularly want to create and sell or highly autonomous weapon systems for law enforcement operations. It's a very promising market. So yes, or I can also name your paper if you're interested in those topics. Okay, good. And when used in law enforcement, but this is, it goes a bit broader, but then it's not international humanitarian law, but human rights law. That's the main legal reference point. So there are different questions. So it is another field. But if you're interested, you can ask me later and I'll give you some minutes. Okay, good. Any other question? Maybe I'll have to speed up a little bit. You have to tell me with regards to time.
Yeah, we're still okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
so now maybe it's a little bit more boring. It's a little bit less pictures and okay. Now I'm going to give you a brief, or as brief as possible, introduction in the group of governmental experts process. If it's all repetition, you can just tell me to stop. Okay. So in 2014, this problem, because of those many novel legal and security problems or challenges in autonomous weapon systems, the United Nations Convention on Conventional Weapons has taken on the discussion of autonomous weapon systems. And as I said before, the Convention on Conventional Weapons is a United Nations framework that basically wants to understand and analyze whether the weapon system that might be put into operation soon is legal from the point of view of international humanitarian law. And last year, a group of governmental experts process was formed. This is a formal discussion. Before, there were several informal discussions. And the group of governmental experts has discussed for about 2 weeks last year, so that's often referred to as the first round. And this year, 2019, is the second round. And there was 1 week of discussions in March, and there are going to be another 2 days at the end of August. In March, about 87 states were represented in this debate. And one very important point, but I'm sure that you know that because you're preparing your simulation, they're deciding not by majority vote, but by unanimity. That means in case someone says no, nothing is going to be decided So the group of governmental experts has a clear mandate and has a clear program of work. It has 4 agenda items, 4 questions. And the question number 1 is, what are the challenges of emerging technologies in the area of autonomous weapon systems? We have talked about those challenges. Some of them are discussed, some of them are not so deeply discussed because states do not have the intention to discuss them or to name them. Then question number 2 is, should we, how can we, do we create a common understanding? Do we set a definition what autonomous weapon systems are? Do we finally, because until now this question is not answered, decide whether we regard laws as a future idea or as something that already exists now? So this is the second agenda item of question number 2. And then, as we have discussed this before with some very good questions, it is generally assumed that a human element must be somewhere either in the development process or in this targeting cycle, because legal accountability cannot be just transferred to an inanimate object or to a software, which is very often even something that is untouchable. So how can we secure meaningful human control? This is a term that I'm sure you have crossed in your preparation. So this is question number 3, and question number 4, how can we address those challenges? Basically, question number 4 is the question about an outcome document. How can we make sure that how we answer those questions is actually more or less set in stone? So, however, up to now, states have not decided on an outcome document, whether to write a legal treaty or a political declaration. So that means that the reason for this is that question number 1, 2, and 3 are not discussed or are not answered. This is why question number 4 hasn't brought a solution yet. So it's going on, it's moving forward relatively slowly, we can say. But it could be that in those 2 days at the end of August, maybe states decide on an outcome document, but that is still very important. Last year, the group of governmental experts has decided upon a document called Guiding Principles. This is no political declaration, this is no legal treaty, this is just a document that sums up more or less the viewpoints of states of last year's discussion, and that should guide the discussion of this year. I don't know if you have read about this document or if you have crossed it. It is sometimes just sold a little bit as something very important. At least we have written something down. So this document includes the idea that international humanitarian law applies to new weapons as it does to autonomous weapons, as it does to any other new weapon as well. And it also includes the general idea that human responsibility must be retained and that there must be a human being somewhere in the development or the targeting cycle. However, this document, I dare say, it is a big mess. There is almost an endless list of bullet points that very often contradict themselves. So it basically reflects the different opinion of states party to the group of governmental experts process. So it is not something to be set in stone, and it is for sure changing a lot. Okay, so what are potential outcome documents? And I think this is important for you because this is what you are going to work on. So there could be a legal treaty. A legal treaty is something that is legally binding. So states would agree that they take on legal duties on themselves. And a legally binding treaty could, in principle, have 3 different forms. And the first one is just to include a positive obligation for states to secure that an element of human control, either in developing autonomous weapon systems or in using autonomous weapon systems or in both. And then a legal treaty could be a comprehensive ban, both of the development and of the use of autonomous weapon systems. This is what some states and many NGOs actually are opting for. However, there's a problem with this option, because when we criminalize also the development of autonomous weapon systems, then the development might be pushed into the shadows, which would make it difficult neutral. Because as we talked at the beginning, certain intentions are there, and intentions, if they're strong, they might not agree with a comprehensive ban. And then the third option is only to prohibit the use, but not the development of autonomous weapon systems. This would still allow the domestic use of autonomous weapon systems, because they can be developed, and international humanitarian law, which is the main architectural characteristic of this forum, only counts in case of armed conflict, but doesn't count for states when they decide to do something within their own national borders. And then another potential outcome document is a political declaration. The political declaration is not legally binding, it's so-called soft law, maybe you've heard this term. And the political declaration could include certain principles, for example, that states have to secure that a human element is somewhere controlled in the use of force. And then this could be just a minimum requirement, and states could have discussions and share best practices on how to implement this principle. So political declaration would also be an encouragement for states to continuously discuss how to include a human being in the use of force, also with current and future weapons. Some states see this as an interim document, that we could have first a political declaration as a start, it is softer, and then discussions can continue, knowledge can be further developed, and maybe at some point states would agree to actually create a legal treaty. And so in case states do not decide on an outcome document, there is a fallback option, or also a parallel option, also if there is an outcome document, which requires states to conduct a review of any new weapon that they intend to put into operation, and that they review and analyze whether this potential weapon complies with international humanitarian law. Those are weapons reviews, the weapons review process at the United Nations, where some states continuously review the legality of the developments. Yes. And now there is some. It's not a document option, but it is something that is discussed. In case states do not reach an agreement, a legal agreement or a political agreement, there are some voices of states and of NGOs that really would like to criminalize or ban autonomous weapon systems in total, to move the discussion outside of this conventional weapons. Because it's very difficult to reach an agreement there because of anonymity voting. So one idea is to move it to the United Nations General Assembly, where decisions are taken by majority vote. And another option is to leave the framework of the United Nations in total. Those are also valuable or potential paths. Some representatives really think that maybe this would be the next step. However, the problem is states that do not follow the opinion, or that do not back the opinion of banning autonomous weapon systems, might not follow and might not want to leave the conventional weapon system. So they might not be in the decision-making process of the final document, and so this document would lack substance in reality. Okay. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so now I would just like to say some words about,
Can I just have one question towards the outcome? How would you evaluate the possibility to create a document like the Montreux document for private military companies that establish some best practices for these companies?
How I would
evaluate that. It was drafted by the ICRC mainly, but it had some effect, I would say. We don't have the involvement of private and military companies in actual warfare, so could have been a very strict and efficient regulation outside of those frameworks.
So you're speaking of a regulation of tech companies then?
Or just create a best practice document like the Montreux document and see what happens.
Best practice document for states?
Yeah.
Yes, this is one option of maybe it's not a political declaration, but it's best practice option, which could maybe be an interim or like a step towards a process, because it would actually force maybe states to continue discussions also on another level outside of this forum.
That was the big concern with the Montreux document, and with the ICRC was very efficient in just gathering support for that. So it's just a thought.
Yeah, I think it is a very, very good thought.
Right.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. So, in what way is this debate limited? So, I've named 4 or 5 problems that seem to me very important. The first problem is the problem of collaboration. That means the accessibility and the use and misuse of autonomous technology in weapon systems by non-state actors, what's often called terrorists, for example. This is a big risk, because less funded and less powerful actors, what non-state actors usually are, they can profit greatly from highly autonomous weapon systems, because autonomous weapon systems can increase the scale of force of those groups. And it is also the case that most probably strong, powerful military state armies are not really interested in weapon systems that are autonomous to a degree that they cannot be overpowered by any high-level military official, because strong classical state militaries are still characterized by a strong chain of subordination and hierarchical system that they're not so interested to give up and to outsource control fully to a software. So proliferation is a problem, and it is not part of the mandate of the group of governmental experts. So they are not discussing it. And then another problem is what has been brought up in a question before, is the following. Classically, when we think about a weapon, it's an object, it's something that we can touch. And the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons is obviously a framework that is based on this classical thinking that when we talk about a weapon, it's something that we can touch. However, as we have said before, the difference between a remotely controlled drone and an autonomous drone lies in the software, not in the casing. So what we're actually talking about is a software. And it is questionable whether or not the group of governmental experts, whether or not those state representatives are capable of discussing and understanding this very fast-changing topic of software. So it could just be that the people that are tasked with dealing about those things are incapable of understanding what they really are. And then the most decisive use of autonomy in future warfare is probably not a drone or a sentry gun, but it is probably autonomous cyber weapons. So I don't know if you know what cyber weapons. Cyber weapons are basically instruments with the intention to harm that navigate in the cyberspace. They're sometimes called malware too. And the cyberspace is the realm of computer networks where information is shared, stored, communicated online, and everyone that uses a computer is also part of the cyberspace. And so the cyberspace is often also regarded as a critical national infrastructure of states. And since more and more information that is generated is actually digitalized and shared and stored and communicated online, a lot of what we create as knowledge is part of this cyberspace. And so cyber weapons could be malware that steals data or intellectual property, that monitors systems or operators of another state, which could be spying. It could be malware that destroys software, hardware, or process control systems of critical infrastructure, such as the electricity grid or water supply, which could then harm a lot of people. Okay, so this is a cyber weapon. And autonomous cyber weapons are interesting because they can handle the very fast processing pace and the huge amount of data that is part of the cyberspace and that is incapable, that humans are actually incapable to handle anymore. So autonomous malware is very, very lucrative from a technological point of view and also from an economic point of view. And it might be key in future warfare. It is so that drones and robots, they get the headlines because they're scary and they're sexy and they fit very well with this horrible and highly unrealistic idea of a killer robot, but it's most probably more ethereal systems that will change the way wars are fought in the future. And also, it's maybe important to understand that in the future, wars will not only be fought on land, at sea, and in the air anymore, and also not only in the cyberspace, but also in outer space and in psychological domains as well, or in electromagnetic fields. And there might be systems of operations in all of those domains, and those systems of operations might be interconnected by information communication technology as well. So in the future, most probably, we should not imagine ourselves armies or only armies fighting against an adversarial army, but there might be systems of operation that confront each other. And this is something very, very important, but it's very rarely talked about. So we have to just keep our minds open and accessible to potential realities of warfare. And as I've said before, autonomous weapon systems during law enforcement are not discussed within the group of governmental experts process, because the group of governmental experts process, being a part of the conventional weapon system, is forced to discuss potential weapons through the lens of international humanitarian law. And international humanitarian law is not a legal reference point outside of the law. So this is something that is missing in the discussion. And then, lastly, it's important to understand that it's not only robotics, and it's not only approaches to artificial intelligence, and it's not only autonomous weapon systems that change the way wars are fought. It is also other emerging technologies, for example, biotechnology, microtechnology, quantum computing, or additive manufacturing, which is often called 3D printing, that change the way wars are fought. And they change the way wars are fought in a particular way. It is that they can connect classical weapons categories, for example, nuclear or cyber or biological weapons, chemical weapons, or autonomous weapons. Classically, we have a very compartmentalized thinking about potential weapons, and also international arms control and disarmament architecture is divided into silos of autonomous weapons, nuclear weapons, biochemical weapons, and so on. However, through new emerging technologies, those weapons categories can come closer and can be interconnected. I'll give you some examples. Artificial intelligence and robotics, they are drivers of autonomous weapon systems, but they also make production and accessibility of pathogens, so bacteria or viruses, much easier because they can automate many steps in the design process of the bacteria, for example. So artificial intelligence and robotics can make accessibility and production of biological weapons much easier. Or, as we have said, autonomous software navigating in the cyberspace is something that might be very risky already now, but even more risky in the future. Or, cyber attacks can sabotage nuclear weapon systems, for example, which could lead to accidental nuclear conflicts. So it's very important that we start to understand that we need to break up our compartmentalized thinking of weapons and create a holistic understanding of all new emerging technologies and an understanding of how they affect weapons and how they affect potential connections of weapon systems. So we need to change our thinking quite a lot in order to integrate everything that's going on in the technological domain now and for sure also in the future. So I will leave it at that. I'm sure it's too long. So feel free to ask further questions. That's it. Have fun.
I have a question regarding classical law enforcement. You mentioned that classical law enforcement.
Yeah.
As you mentioned that a police officer is more likely to not use deadly force when using force. But is it like if a police officer, for example, I think that's very European view on things, uses the firearm, that he's supposed to basically shoot the leg or so first, while in the US, for example, when applying the use of firearms, deadly force is the way to go, because the moment you overstep that boundary of using the firearm, deadly force is police, so that's very European perception right there, right?
Yes, it is. So the perception that I put forward, I didn't say it's he is more likely to use. I said it is legally per se required not to shoot unless the harm is imminent. And this is a perspective of international human rights law, so not national regulations, and they are different in different countries. And I am not 100% sure whether or not the US regulations are actually potentially violating international human rights law with regards to law enforcement. So yes, there are differences, and this is a debate that still needs to be. It has been started before the one group of governmental experts, but it's on very low profile, and it for sure has to be continued and discussed more in detail. Did I answer your question? No, you don't seem satisfied.
I guess sufficiently, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that it was mostly developed in the UK and the US.
No. I said that with regards to potential swarms, that there are initiatives in the US, and there are public voices that say in the UK that this should be a path to go in future wars. But I didn't say that all these weapons are only developed in the US.
That was actually my question.
Yeah.
Is it still like a monopoly of like Western powers on that, or how
You know, there are other countries that are, let's say, significant in this regard. That is South Korea, for example, or Israel, or China as well.
Okay, so thank you very much. We'll call it there. Perfect, thank you.